Hey guys, I'm Tad, and tonight we're going over world building. So basically, this is in regards to Dungeons and Dragons. For those of you who haven't watched my other video, go down to the link at the description and watch that one. This is going to be the second video in the series to teach people how to DM. What's first? Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically go over everything you're going to need for your world building. We'll start with that, seeing as that seems to be pretty much basic starting point. So you should have everything you need together in order to run the game. So now we're going to cover what you're going to need in order to build the world. So first of all, what you've got to decide is what kind of period do you want to set your game in. You can set it in the past, you can set it in the present, you can set it in the future, or it can be fantasy, which is typically a hybrid of a few different things. Surprisingly enough, D&D rules are pretty adaptable, and it's pretty easy to adapt it to, for example, post-apocalyptic or futuristic. All you need to do is rejig the weapon and armor system, and you just change a few names around and you can actually adapt it pretty easily. So there's that. So you choose your period, and then you've got to choose your template. Now you can use an existing world, you can create an entire world from scratch, or you can use a hybrid. So probably the easiest one would be to use an existing world and basically take either one supplied by Wizards of the Coast, which is on the website and in the player's handbook. You can sort of use their world, which has everything already in it populated. You've got quests as well that you can buy in books. It's all ready to go for you there. You can use a hybrid, so you can take their world and then you can change names around, and you can add things in and remove things, and you can even use Lord of the Rings setting. You can use Middle Earth. You can use anything, any world you want. It's entirely up to you. Or you can start a world from scratch. Now that's probably the part that I'm going to teach you guys how to do, because that's one, it's probably the most fun. Two, it's probably the easiest, especially when you're creating a world. If you've got someone who, for example, is a big fan of Lord of the Rings and is a bit of a buff, and you bring in a creature like a kraken or something similar, and all of a sudden your player interrupts the entire game in the climactic scene that was about to ensue to tell you that krakens don't exist in Lord of the Rings. Now, that's a really awkward situation, and you don't want to be put in that, so I'd avoid taking a world completely. If you're going to take a world, try and change a few things. But starting a new world is probably the best. So we'll go down that path. So first of all, you've got to choose your level of detail. Now you can do a low level of detail where you don't really go into people's name. You don't go into towns as much, like as in the level of detail behind the shopkeeper's history of owning the store and everything like that. It saves you a lot of work if you sort of skim through a lot of things and keep the detail relatively low to things that only the players really need to know. So you don't do any of the background stuff. You don't create minerals, you don't create animals and all that sort of stuff. You could do a medium level of detail where you do some of that stuff, you create things, or you can go high. You can go a high level of detail, which is what I prefer to do. It gives your players a bit more of an engrossing feeling, like they're actually in a world, and it gives them a lot more of a sense of place, and they get taken away with it. If they've got a whole world that's got religions and languages and all this sort of stuff, then all of a sudden they feel like they've been taken up in more than just a game. So the level of detail is something you need to look at. And obviously the higher level of detail, the more work you're going to have to put in. So it depends what you want to do. There's a lot of template worlds out there and fan art and all that sort of stuff, so it's not as hard as you think it is. Then you've got to choose your conflict. Now, this is a conflict for the world. It's not just your characters. So forget your characters for the moment. You'll come back to them later. You've got to do the conflict that the world is currently in. Now, it's pretty boring for a world to be at peace. And if you're doing a fantasy setting, that's almost never the case. There's always some sort of conflict somewhere, whether it be religious. We've got two, maybe three, maybe more religions all conflicting against each other and causing problems for each other. You could have territorial. So they're either fighting for extra land, or they're fighting to defend their lands, or they are fighting for the right to control a neutral territory maybe. So territory is another major one. So you've got religion and territory. The next one is resource. So when you've got multiple factions fighting for a scarce resource, or maybe they're fighting to defend the resource. Perhaps that resource is something that they need to go looking for in order to survive, or it's worth a lot of money. So that could be another one. Money is also a resource. So if the fight is over wealth, then that is a perfect conflict for resource. So you've got three there. Political is another one, another good one. Now, political can be all sorts of things. Like it can be everything from two kings fighting against each other. That's political. But it could also be the fact that one was murdered by the other, and so their entire kingdom is now up in arms against the other. So that's a political conflict right there. And survival is another one. So if you've got, for example, an invading force that just want to just destroy everything and kill everyone, then survival is going to be the major conflict for that region. So the region will be fighting basically to stay alive, or in the other case, to try and kill things. And the last one that I can think of right now off the top of my head, but I know as soon as I'll stop recording I'll find another, is racial. Now, racial is something that I try and stay away from, not because it's hard to deal with. Well, it is hard to deal with. So racial is a difficult one, because when you bring races into it, it limits the races that characters can play as. Unless you start getting really creative, then your characters start losing abilities to choose whatever race they want. They lose the ability to go to certain parts of the map. And you also limit the possibilities for the storyline a lot, because basically they'll be meeting the same people of the same race. And so unless you exclude one race, which is doable, unless you exclude just one race, then you're going to have a lot of issues with the fact that you're basically going to meet all of the same people, and it'll be really one-dimensional. So also you'll find that a lot of these conflicts they all happen at the same sort of time sometimes. You've got the religious, the territorial, the resource, the political, the survival, and the racial. Now, what can happen is multiple things can happen at the same time. Now, you could have political conflict that has stemmed from religious problems. So you've got two religions, and then it becomes political when someone else gets involved. Then all of a sudden, they're fighting over a territory which is holding religious importance to one faction and not to the other. So you've got a religious and political conflict that's just gotten territorial. So whilst they've taken that control of that section, then they're now trying to kill off the people they've taken the land from. So you've got religious, political, and territorial, along with now a survival conflict. So all of a sudden it's become really multi-dimensional. You've got a lot of things happening at once, and then it gives you a lot more direction for the storyline to go. You don't want to make one thing happen, because if that problem gets resolved, then all of a sudden there's no real reason for conflict, and then the story becomes really boring. So a global conflict is something that is really good for the storyline, and it's also it's pretty cool to have something going on in the background. It makes the world seem like it's not revolving around the players. It makes them feel part of the world, not the world itself. The next thing I'd focus on is magic. Now, magic is, well, you've got to decide whether you even want it or not. Recommend so, seeing as D&D involves a lot of magic, especially with the whole dragons thing. So magic, you've got to decide the frequency you want to see it. Now, it can be common, so everyone is able to practice magic, or nearly everyone. It can be uncommon, so you have to go learn how to use magic perhaps, or you're born with it. Uh, then there's rare, which would be that you'd have to go and actually find someone to teach you magic, or you come across it in a certain amount of children, or it just develops. So that'd be rare. You'd have maybe 3 out of the 5 players in your party being able to cast it. That'd be uncommon. Rare would be if one person could cast it. So you don't want to limit the players too much, and it's a pretty big coincidence if it's completely rare and barely ever heard of, and you've got a whole team of players that can cast it. It's kind of a little bit of a faux pas on that one. And then there's none. So you can have no magic. There's nothing saying you have to have magic. You can make it set in the past fantasy where there is no access to magic whatsoever. So the players will have to rely on martial combat. The problem with that is that it gets boring quickly. Magic adds massive amounts of flavor to the game, and I'd really recommend including magic in the game if you're looking for something to increase the laughs and increase the flavor of the game. So that's what you've got to decide on. Then you've got to decide on races. Now your classes and races sort of mix in with each other, whether you want to allow any players to pick any race and any players to pick any class. Now, there are some classes that you may not want to include because they seem to be a little broken. Paladins maybe being one of them. Maybe you're not a fan of paladins. The whole bubble hearth maybe bothers the shit out of you, and that's completely fine. If you don't want to have paladins, you don't include them. You just got to let your players know beforehand so they don't get their hopes up. The other thing is races. Now, there's a few races. There's obviously the stereotypical races, so you don't want to get rid of your orcs or your humans, obviously, or your elves or anything like that. But there's races, for example, like Tiefling and Dragonborn. Now, you don't have to include them. A Gnome is another one. You don't have to include them. It increases the flavor if you do, but it just, it's something that you don't have to worry about trying to fit into the game if you don't want to. So that's something you've got to choose, whether you want everyone to be specific races. For example, in my world itself, we don't have elves. Now, as bizarre as that sounds, it's because elves are immortal. And so that means they basically live for about 500 or 600 years before they die, voluntarily. And in that time, they train with weaponry and they practice magic and they hone those skills over 500 or 600 years. When you're versing a human who's had maybe 25 years experience with a sword, and you've got over 600 years of experience with that same sword, there is no possible way for that human to beat you in combat. So it really doesn't make sense that we have elves in our world, because they basically never lose. They roll a d20 with a plus 20 bonus. Like the proficiency would just be ridiculous. So we have elves, and 2 of my players are elves. 3 of my players are elves, and basically the way I allow them to be elves is because they're not full blood; they're half blood elves, so they have the immortality bred out of them. That allows you to basically play with any race, but it just means that it's not broken. So they're the sort of things you have to think about when you're bringing in certain races. Is what effect will it have on the game if I bring them in? What are the ups and downs? And basically, if you're creating a world by yourself, you can literally structure everything how you want it. You can do whatever you want. With a hybrid world, you've got some of that, but you also have some constraints of the world you borrow. And with the borrowed world, you've basically got all of the rules are already written as far as races go and how they interact and everything like that. Orcs are stupid, elves live forever, that sort of thing. So if you're going to just bring a world over, you're going to have problems if you don't like the certain rules, because then you start chopping and changing things and it becomes a little bit hard to keep track of. Because all of a sudden it's, oh, by the way, elves are immortal, so that character can't die. Okay, the next stage is building the map. Now, this is the part I enjoy the most, but some people find it an absolute nightmare. So I'm going to have a whole episode, probably next, based on how to build a map. So I'll go over all that later. So, but building the map is the next important thing. The one thing I will say before we even start that is when it comes to building a map, black holes are key. They are the most important thing. And I don't mean create a black hole in the middle of the map for everything to get sucked in. Not that kind of black hole. What I'm talking about is unexplored areas of the map. You want those sections. One, because it leaves storyline area open for you, so you can create on the move, or you can create if players decide to go in that direction. It also makes the game a little bit more interesting because the players don't know what's in that area. And it also means that if you were to think of something that would be cool, you've got space to put it. So black holes are a good idea. And so the next one, religions. Religions are something you have to think about because if you're creating a world from scratch, there's a high chance that there will be at least one religion. I'd recommend having more than one, and as well as a faction or some peoples that don't follow religion at all. It just happens. So even if there's not a religious conflict, having multiple religions is a good idea. It adds flavor to the game. It allows your players to sort of be a little bit more individualized if they've got different views. And it adds a bit more of a dimension. You can have things like churches, you can have crypts and all that sort of stuff. Don't forget, if there is no religion, then maybe people don't even get buried. Maybe there is no mausoleums. Maybe because they don't need to get buried, they just get burned. So it opens up a lot more avenues for you having religion in there somewhere. So think about that. The main part after religion will be factions. Now, factions are something that you're going to have to really take your time and develop. Factions, my rule is 3 is a bad number, and that's because if 2 decide to go against the 1, you've always got an uneven fight, and it's never, never, ever a perfect split between 3 factions. You'll never have one faction hates this faction, and they hate that faction, and they hate that faction, so all of them fight. That doesn't make sense. It never happens. You can do it like that if you really, really want to, but I'm saying it's bad. So have a couple of factions, at least 2. It means you've got a bit of an area for conflict to occur if it's not happening right now already. It also means that if you've got at least 2 factions, that the players can sort of maybe even decide between the 2 which one they'd like to align with. It gives them a little bit more room to move. Also, with the factions, what was I even if you had one faction that actually, whilst the players were playing, their actions actually made it a civil war breakout, which made the faction split into half. That would be kind of cool. So you could always run it like that. The next thing to think about would be how they live. So whether they congregate in cities or small towns, villages. Developmentally, you want to decide what stage the world is at. So they could, they could still be living in caves if you really wanted them to, underground caves, with networks of tunnels and that sort of thing. Or they could be living in small villages scattered across the world. You want to try and get an idea of what kind of population you want, whether it's reasonably scattered or small congregations. Maybe big congregations, towns, or cities. You want, 2 major cities and a couple of outlying towns, and that's sort of it. So you've got to decide where you want them living. Then you've got to do languages, whether you want to run with the ones in the book, which is what I do, or you want to add certain languages to it. You don't have to go into how they speak it and actually learn how to write it and everything like that. If you just you write it down an alphabet, and then you put a bunch of symbols next to each letter, it becomes directly translatable into English, so the players can then read it. And you don't have to you can sort of give them those in sections, or you write them basically whenever there's something written in that, you write the symbols down and then just decode it. So you could do it like that, basically. Then there's animals and plants, so whether you want to create new ones or run through the ones in the books, either one of those approaches work. However, you can create your own and rename and develop different things. It's always exciting making new stuff, especially when your players, sort of bring it to life and draw pictures for you and all that sort of thing, how they look. And then the last and final thing, which is pretty much overarching storyline. Now, you've got to have a storyline for this campaign. whether you want them to start off as villagers and travel around the world and eventually become lords of certain areas or fight against a titan or something like that. You've got to come up with a storyline that you think is compelling, that you can read more than 3 times without getting bored, and that's not totally foreseeable. You don't want something where it's pretty much like a grab out of Lord of the Rings, where they've got to take a ring to a mountain and throw it in there. And by the way, there's a guy trying to get you, because that'd be kind of boring. So try and think of something original. Try and take from a few different movies and mold them together. So you get the start, the beginning, and the end, and you sort of take a bit from each and then work them together. So that's an idea, but basically you want to try and come up with an overall storyline before the game starts, because you want to know which direction you're going to pull them. So with all those things in mind, that's the idea of basically world building. That's all the bits you'll need. How you fit them together is up to you. If you do have any questions, please comment below and I will do my best to answer them. And if you've got any certain things you'd like me to do videos on, certain sections of D&D or indeed other games, though my knowledge is pretty limited to D&D unfortunately, yeah, you basically just comment below and I'll do my best to try and answer them. So yeah, without further ado, thanks for watching guys, and yeah, good luck with your world building. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.